My name is Amara, and this is the story of how my father's final act of love became the most devastating revenge against the woman who raised me, but never truly accepted me. If you've ever felt like an outsider in your own family, if you've ever questioned whether blood really makes family, then you need to hear what happened in that cold library on the day that changed everything. But before I tell you about the moment my world turned upside down, let me paint you a picture of the woman who spent 23 years making me feel like I was never quite enough. Eleanor Whitmore was the kind of woman who could smile at you while cutting you down to size. She was old money, the kind that comes with expectations and traditions that go back generations. Her ancestors had portraits in the hallway, and she never let anyone forget it. When she married my father, Richard Whitmore, she was marrying into even older money, and when they adopted me at age 3, I became part of their world whether I belonged or not. And according to Eleanor, I never quite belonged. Picture this: a sprawling mansion in the most exclusive part of town, with manicured gardens that looked like they belonged in a magazine. Inside, every room was decorated with antiques and artwork that cost more than most people make in a year. The library where our story takes place was Eleanor's pride and joy, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes that looked impressive but were rarely read. It was in this very room that Eleanor would host her charity committee meetings, where she would proudly introduce me as our adopted daughter Amara, such a bright girl, while her friends would nod approvingly at her charitable spirit. But today, just 3 days after my father's funeral, the library felt different. The morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed colder somehow, and the familiar smell of old books and Eleanor's expensive perfume couldn't mask the tension that hung in the air like smoke. I sat in the leather chair that had always been designated as mine during family meetings, though I never felt like it truly was. My hands were folded in my lap, and I could feel Eleanor's eyes on me from across the room. She was dressed in black, of course, the perfect picture of a grieving widow. Her silver hair was styled to perfection, not a strand out of place, and her makeup was flawless despite the tears she claimed to have shed. But I knew Eleanor well enough to recognize the calculation behind her grief. She was already planning, already thinking about what came next, and I could see it in the way she kept glancing at the door, waiting for the lawyer to arrive. "Amara, dear," she said, her voice carrying that tone I knew so well, the one that sounded caring but had sharp edges underneath. "I know this is difficult for you. Your father's death has been hard on all of us." She paused, smoothing down her black dress with perfectly manicured hands. "But we need to be practical about what happens next." I didn't respond immediately. I was thinking about my father, about the way he used to sit in that very chair during Sunday morning coffee, reading the financial pages while explaining to me how the stock market worked. He never talked down to me, never made me feel like I was too young or too different to understand. He would point to various companies and tell me their stories, how they grew or failed, and what we could learn from their journeys. "Business is about people, Amara," he would say. "Never forget that behind every number is a human story." Eleanor moved closer, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor, in a rhythm that seemed to count down to something. She settled into the chair next to mine, close enough that I could smell her perfume more strongly. It was the same scent she'd worn for as long as I could remember, something French and expensive that came in a crystal bottle she kept on her vanity table. "I want you to know," she continued, reaching over to pat my hand in what probably looked like a motherly gesture to anyone watching, "that no matter what happens today, you'll always have a place in this family. Your father made sure of that." But there was something in her tone, something that made my stomach tighten with unease. And then she said the words that would be burned into my memory forever. "But Amara, sweetheart, we need to be realistic here. You're not blood, honey. You're not really family in the way that matters for business decisions. Don't get your hopes up about the will reading. I just don't want you to be disappointed." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not blood, not really family. I had heard variations of this theme my entire life, but never so directly, never so coldly. I felt my chest tighten, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. But instead of crying, instead of arguing, something else happened. I felt a strange calm settle over me, and I found myself remembering. If you've ever experienced that particular kind of pain that comes from being told you don't belong by the person who's supposed to love you unconditionally, then you know exactly what I felt in that moment. It's not just hurt. It's a validation of every doubt you've ever had about your place in the world. And if you understand that pain, then you need to subscribe to Black Revenge Diaries, because this is where we tell the stories of how love and loyalty triumph over blood and biology every single time. I remembered being 7 years old, coming home from school with a report card full of A's, so excited to show my parents. I found Eleanor first, in her sitting room, having tea with one of her friends from the country club. I burst in with all the enthusiasm of a child who had worked hard and wanted to share her success. "Mom, look, I got straight A's," I announced, waving the paper in the air. Eleanor barely glanced up from her conversation. "That's nice, dear," she said dismissively. "Why don't you go show your father? He's in his study." Her friend Mrs. Patterson smiled politely and said, "How wonderful, Eleanor. You must be so proud." "Of course," Eleanor replied, but I could hear the lack of conviction in her voice. "She's always been a good student." I left the room feeling deflated, but I found my father in his study, buried in paperwork as usual. When I showed him my report card, his face lit up like I had just handed him $1 million. "Amara, this is incredible!" He picked me up and spun me around, making me giggle despite my earlier disappointment. "Straight A's. Do you know how proud I am of you?" He didn't just praise me and move on. He cleared a space on his desk, pulled out a special frame he kept for important documents, and carefully placed my report card inside. Then he hung it on the wall behind his desk, right next to his business degree and various awards. "There," he said, stepping back to admire it. "Now everyone who comes into my office will know how brilliant my daughter is." That report card stayed on his wall for years, even after newer ones replaced it. Every time I walked into his study, I could see it there, and I felt like I mattered. But the contrast with Eleanor's reaction stayed with me too. Even at 7, I understood that there was a difference in how they saw me. I remembered being 10 years old, getting ready for my first school dance. I had been so excited about it for weeks, and I had picked out a dress that made me feel like a princess. But when it came time to do my hair, Eleanor looked at me with that expression I had learned to recognize. The one that said she was dealing with a problem she didn't know how to solve. "Amara, honey," she said, holding my brush like it was a foreign object. "I'm not really sure how to... Well, your hair is so different from mine. Maybe we should just pull it back in a ponytail." I could see her frustration, and even though I was just 10, I felt embarrassed. My hair was different, and Eleanor made it clear that different was difficult. She pulled it back tightly, so tightly that it hurt, and secured it with an elastic band. "There," she said. But she didn't sound satisfied. "That will have to do." I looked in the mirror and felt ugly. The tight ponytail made my face look harsh, and I could see Eleanor's dissatisfaction reflected in the mirror behind me. But before I could say anything, my father appeared in the doorway. "What's going on in here?" he asked, and I saw his expression change when he looked at me. Not disapproval, but something like determination. "Richard, I was just trying to do something with her hair, but I don't really know how to..." Eleanor began, but my father was already moving. "Come on, Amara," he said, gently removing the elastic band. "Let's see what we can do." What followed was one of the most touching memories of my childhood. My father, this successful businessman who commanded boardrooms and made $1-million deals, sat on the floor of my bedroom with a tablet, watching YouTube tutorials on how to braid black hair. He practiced on me for over an hour, his big hands surprisingly gentle as he worked. "Daddy, you don't have to," I started to say, but he shushed me softly. "A father should know how to make his daughter feel beautiful," he said simply. "And you are beautiful, Amara. Don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise." By the time he finished, I had the most beautiful braided updo I had ever seen. It was intricate and elegant, and when I looked in the mirror, I felt like the princess I had wanted to be. But more than that, I felt loved. I felt seen. Eleanor watched from the doorway, and I saw something flicker across her face. Not approval, exactly, but maybe a recognition that she had been shown up by her husband's willingness to learn something she couldn't be bothered with. "Very nice," she said stiffly. "You two certainly spent a lot of time on that." But my father just smiled and kissed the top of my head. "Time well spent," he said. My daughter deserves to feel beautiful. That night, I danced with confidence, and every compliment I received on my hair felt like a validation of my father's love. But I also carried with me the memory of Eleanor's reluctance, her clear discomfort with the parts of me that didn't fit into her world. The pattern continued throughout my childhood and teenage years. Eleanor would make an effort when it served her purposes, especially when her friends were around. She would brag about my accomplishments, my grades, my acceptance to prestigious universities. But in private, there was always a distance, always a sense that I was a project rather than a person. I remembered my high school graduation, when I was valedictorian of my class. Eleanor made sure to invite all her friends to the ceremony, and she wore her most expensive dress, making sure everyone knew she was the mother of the star student. But when I gave my speech, talking about family and gratitude, I saw her checking her phone, more interested in social media than in listening to what I had to say. After the ceremony, during the reception, I overheard her talking to Mrs. Patterson again. "Of course we're proud," Eleanor was saying. "Though I have to admit, it's been quite a journey. Adopting a child is such a leap of faith, you know. You never know how they'll turn out." The words stung because they reduced my achievements to a lucky accident rather than the result of hard work and the love and support I had received from my father. But Mrs. Patterson's response was even worse. "Well, you certainly drew the lucky straw, Eleanor. She's turned out beautifully. Such a credit to you and Richard." A credit. Like I was a charitable donation that had paid off well. I felt my chest tighten with familiar pain, but before I could spiral too far into hurt, I felt my father's hand on my shoulder. "There's my brilliant daughter," he said loudly enough for Eleanor and her friends to hear. "Amara, I was just telling the Hendersons about your full scholarship to Columbia. Did you know she's planning to double major in business and literature?" He wasn't just proud, he was showing off. And the way he said "my brilliant daughter" made it clear that he saw no difference between me and any biological child he might have had. I was his, completely and without reservation. Eleanor smiled tightly. "Yes, we're very proud," she said, but I could hear the forced nature of her enthusiasm. That night, after all the guests had gone home, I found my father in his study, updating his will. I didn't know that's what he was doing at the time, but I remember asking him about the papers spread across his desk. "Just making sure everything is in order, sweetheart," he said. But there was something in his expression that I didn't understand then. Making sure the people I love are taken care of. I was 17 then, about to leave for college, and I thought he was just being overly cautious. But now, sitting in that library with Eleanor's cruel words echoing in my mind, I wondered if he had already seen what I was too young to understand. Had he already recognized that Eleanor's love for me was conditional, performative, and ultimately limited by her inability to see past blood to the heart of what makes a family? College was a relief in many ways. I was away from Eleanor's constant, subtle reminders that I didn't quite belong, and I could be myself without worrying about fitting into her narrow definition of acceptable. But I stayed close to my father, calling him every week, sharing my successes and my struggles. He remained my anchor, my biggest supporter, and the one person who made me feel like I was exactly where I belonged in the world. Eleanor and I maintained a polite but distant relationship during those years. When I came home for holidays, she was pleasant enough, but I could feel the walls she had built around herself, the barriers that kept me at arm's length. She would ask about my classes and my friends, but in the same tone she might use to inquire about the weather. Polite interest, nothing more. But my father was different. He wanted to know everything. He read my papers, discussed my professors, and even visited me at school several times. He met my friends, took us all out to dinner, and embarrassed me in the way that loving parents do by bragging about me to anyone who would listen. "This is my daughter, Amara," he would say to waiters, professors, random people we met. "She's going to change the world someday." And I believed him. When someone loves you that completely, that unconditionally, you start to believe that maybe you really can change the world. After graduation, I came back home to work in my father's company. He had offered me a position in his firm. Not because I was family, but because I had earned it. I had graduated summa cum laude with a double major, and I had already proven myself through internships and academic achievements. But Eleanor made it clear that she thought this was just another example of my father's favoritism. "I hope you're not expecting special treatment just because you're Richard's daughter," she said on my first day. And the way she said daughter made it sound like she was using air quotes. But I didn't need special treatment. I worked harder than anyone else in that office, stayed later, took on extra projects, and consistently exceeded expectations. Within 2 years, I was promoted to senior analyst, and within 4 years, I was being groomed for a leadership position. My father was proud, but he was also careful to make sure everyone knew I had earned my place through merit, not nepotism. Eleanor watched all of this with what I can only describe as resigned tolerance. She would make the appropriate noises when my father bragged about my successes, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. She was waiting for something, though I didn't know what. I found out what she was waiting for when my father got sick. It started with small things. He would forget appointments, misplace important documents, or repeat himself in conversations. At first, we all attributed it to stress and overwork, but as the symptoms progressed, we couldn't ignore them anymore. The diagnosis was early-onset Alzheimer's, and it hit our family like a bomb. Eleanor's reaction was complex. She was devastated, of course, but I could also see her already planning for a future without him. She started taking more control of household decisions, inserting herself into business conversations, and making it clear that she expected to be consulted on all major decisions. But my father, even as his condition worsened, remained sharp when it came to business and family. He knew what was happening to him, and he was determined to set things right while he still could. "Amara," he said to me one evening, about 6 months before he died, "I need you to know something. Whatever happens to me, whatever Eleanor says or does, you are my daughter. You are my heir in every way that matters." I thought he was just being sentimental, trying to reassure me as his condition progressed, but there was something in his tone, something urgent and deliberate, that made me pay attention. "Daddy, you don't need to worry about any of that right now," I said, but he interrupted me. "I do need to worry about it," he said firmly. "I need to worry about it because I love you, and I need to make sure you're protected." Protected from what? I wondered, but I didn't ask, because I could see how much the conversation was costing him. The last 2 years of his life were heartbreaking. Watching someone you love disappear piece by piece is a special kind of torture, but even as his memory faded, even as he sometimes forgot my name or couldn't remember what year it was, he never forgot that he loved me. Even on his worst days, when he was confused and frightened, he would see me and his face would light up with recognition and warmth. Eleanor cared for him with efficiency and duty, but I could see her growing impatience with his condition. She hired nurses and made sure he had the best medical care. But she seemed to view his illness as an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. She would sigh when he repeated himself, roll her eyes when he forgot things, and speak about him in the third person, even when he was in the room. "He's having a bad day," she would tell the nurses, as if he couldn't hear her. "He probably won't remember any of this tomorrow anyway," but I remembered everything. I remembered every conversation, every moment of clarity, every time he looked at me with love and recognition. I treasured those moments because I knew they were limited. The funeral was exactly what Eleanor wanted it to be. Elegant, well-attended, and perfectly orchestrated. She played the grieving widow with practiced grace, accepting condolences with appropriate dignity, and making sure everyone knew how much she had sacrificed to care for her husband during his illness. But I could see through the performance. I could see her relief, her sense of finally being free from the burden of caring for someone who was no longer the man she had married. And I could see something else too. Anticipation. She was already thinking about what came next, about how she would reshape her life now that she was no longer tied to my father's needs and expectations. Which brings us back to that library, to that moment when she told me I wasn't blood, wasn't really family, wasn't entitled to expect anything from my father's will. The pain of those words was immediate and sharp, but it was also familiar. It was the culmination of 20 years of subtle messages, 20 years of being made to feel like an outsider in my own home. But as I sat there, processing her cruelty, I realized something important. I wasn't that confused little girl anymore. I was a grown woman who had been loved unconditionally by the man who mattered most, and no amount of Eleanor's poison could take that away from me. What do you think defines a real family? Is it blood? Or is it love? Is it biology? Or is it the choice to show up for someone every single day, no matter what? If you've ever questioned whether you truly belong somewhere, or if you've ever felt like you had to prove your worth to the people who should love you unconditionally, I want you to like this video and leave a comment telling me your story. Because family isn't about who gave birth to you or who shares your DNA. Family is about who sees you, who celebrates you, and who fights for you, even when you're not in the room. The lawyer arrived exactly at 10 o'clock, just as Eleanor had scheduled. James Morrison had been my father's attorney for over 20 years, and he had handled all of the family's legal affairs for as long as I could remember. He was a kind man in his 60s, with silver hair and gentle eyes that had always made me feel comfortable during the few times I had met him. But today, he looked unusually serious, almost somber, as he entered the library carrying a leather briefcase and a manila envelope that seemed to contain much more than a simple will. "Mrs. Whitmore, Amara," he said, nodding to each of us in turn. "I'm sorry for your loss. Richard was a good man and a dear friend." Eleanor stood to greet him, smoothing down her dress and offering him her hand with practiced grace. "Thank you, James. We appreciate you handling this so quickly. I know Richard would have wanted things settled efficiently." There was something in the way she said it that made me pay attention. She was already assuming control, already speaking as if she knew what my father would have wanted. But Mr. Morrison didn't respond to her presumption with the deference she expected. "Actually, Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, "Richard was very specific about his wishes. Very specific indeed." He opened his briefcase and removed several documents, spreading them across the mahogany table that dominated the center of the room. I could see that the will was much longer than I had expected, and that there were additional documents I couldn't identify. "Before we begin," Mr. Morrison continued, "I want you both to know that Richard came to see me several times over the past 2 years to update and revise his will. He was very clear about his intentions, and he made sure everything was legally sound and properly witnessed." Eleanor's confidence faltered slightly. "Updated? I don't understand. We haven't discussed any changes to our estate planning." "No," Mr. Morrison said quietly. "I don't believe you have." He looked at me then, and I saw something in his expression that I couldn't quite interpret. Sympathy? Concern? Or maybe something else entirely. "Shall we begin?" he asked, and both Eleanor and I nodded. "I, Richard James Whitmore, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament," Mr. Morrison began, his voice taking on the formal tone required for such occasions. The first part of the will was fairly standard, covering funeral arrangements and the disposal of personal effects. My father had been specific about wanting a simple service, and he had requested that his personal library be donated to the local university. He had also specified that his collection of vintage watches should go to his business partner, who had always admired them. But as Mr. Morrison continued reading, I could see Eleanor growing more impatient. She kept glancing at her watch, tapping her manicured nails on the arm of her chair, and shifting in her seat. She was waiting for the important part, the part that would tell her what she was inheriting. "To my wife, Eleanor Margaret Whitmore," Mr. Morrison read, and Eleanor straightened in her chair, her full attention now focused on the lawyer's words. "I leave the sum of $2 million, to be paid out in monthly installments of $10,000, as specified in our prenuptial agreement. I also leave her the house in Martha's Vineyard, which she has always loved, and the contents thereof. Additionally, I leave her the jewelry collection she has accumulated during our marriage, with the exception of my mother's engagement ring, which has a different designation." Eleanor's face went white. "Prenuptial agreement," she stammered. "What prenuptial agreement? That was so long ago." Mr. Morrison looked at her with professional sympathy. "Mrs. Whitmore, you signed a prenuptial agreement 3 days before your wedding. It's all here in the file, properly witnessed and notarized." I watched Eleanor's world crumble in real time. She had clearly expected to inherit everything, or at least the majority of my father's estate. The realization that she was limited to the terms of a prenuptial agreement she had apparently forgotten about hit her like a physical blow. But Mr. Morrison wasn't finished. "The will also includes a personal message for you, Eleanor. Richard asked me to read this part exactly as he wrote it. He cleared his throat and continued, "Eleanor, you have been my wife for 25 years, and I have tried to be a good husband to you, but I have also watched you struggle to love my daughter the way she deserves to be loved. I hope that in the years to come, you will find it in your heart to see Amara as I have always seen her, as a gift, not a burden, as a daughter, not a charity case. Love should not be conditional on biology, and I pray that someday you will understand that." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor stared at Mr. Morrison as if he had just spoken in a foreign language, and I could see her mind racing, trying to process what she had just heard. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's limiting me to the prenup. What about everything else? The company? The main house? The investment portfolio?" Mr. Morrison looked at her with something that might have been pity. "Mrs. Whitmore, your husband was very clear about his intentions regarding the remainder of his estate." He turned to me, and I felt my heart start to race. I had never expected to inherit anything significant. Eleanor had spent years making it clear that I was not a real member of the family, and I had accepted that reality. But now, seeing the lawyer's expression, I realized that my father had been planning something I never could have imagined. "Amara," Mr. Morrison said, his voice gentle but clear, "your father wanted me to read this part of the will to you directly." In his own words, he lifted a separate document, and I could see my father's handwriting on the pages. Even through my shock and confusion, seeing his familiar script made my eyes fill with tears. "My dearest Amara," Mr. Morrison read, "if you are hearing this, then I am gone. And I hope you know how much I loved you. From the moment you came into our lives as a scared 3-year-old, you have been the light of my world. You have brought me more joy, more pride, and more love than I ever thought possible." I was crying now, unable to stop the tears that had been building since my father's death. But Mr. Morrison continued, his voice steady and sure. "I have watched you grow into an extraordinary woman, someone who is intelligent, compassionate, and strong. You have faced challenges that would break most people, and you have emerged from each one more beautiful than before. You have been my daughter in every way that matters, and I could not be more proud of the woman you have become." Eleanor made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob, but I couldn't look at her. I was focused entirely on my father's words, on this final message of love that he had left for me. "I know that you have sometimes felt like an outsider in our family," the will continued, "and I take responsibility for not protecting you from that feeling. But I want you to know that you were never an outsider to me. You were my daughter, my heir, and my greatest achievement. Not because of what you accomplished, though I am proud of all of that, but because of who you are." Mr. Morrison paused, looking at me with kind eyes. "Are you ready for me to continue, Amara?" I nodded, wiping my eyes with the tissue he offered me. "Therefore," he read, "I leave the entirety of my remaining estate to my beloved daughter, Amara. This includes the family home and all its contents, my investment portfolio, my shares in all business ventures, and full control of Whitmore Industries. I also leave her my mother's engagement ring, which I have kept for the daughter I always hoped to have." The words hit me like a thunderbolt. Everything. He had left me everything. Eleanor's reaction was immediate and explosive. "That's impossible," she shouted, jumping to her feet. "She's not even his real daughter. She has no right to any of this." But Mr. Morrison remained calm, his voice level and professional. "Mrs. Whitmore, I understand this is difficult, but the will is legal and binding. Richard was very clear about his wishes, and he took steps to ensure that his intentions could not be challenged. But she's adopted," Eleanor continued, her voice rising to a near shriek. "She's not blood. She's not family." And that's when Mr. Morrison said something that I will remember for the rest of my life. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, "in the eyes of the law, and more importantly, in the eyes of her father, Amara is exactly as much his daughter as any biological child would be. Richard made that very clear to me on multiple occasions. He also made it clear that he was disappointed in your inability to see that." Eleanor collapsed back into her chair, the fight going out of her as suddenly as it had erupted. She looked older somehow, diminished by the realization that the man she had been married to for 25 years had seen right through her, had recognized her limitations and her cruelty, and had chosen to protect the daughter she had never fully accepted. "There's one more thing," Mr. Morrison said, and I could see that he was almost finished with the formal reading. "Richard also left a sealed letter for Amara, to be opened only by her, and only after the will has been read." He handed me an envelope with my name written on it in my father's careful handwriting. My hands were shaking as I took it, and I could feel Eleanor's eyes on me, watching my every move. "I think," Mr. Morrison said diplomatically, "this might be a good time for me to give you both some privacy to process this information. Amara, when you're ready, I'll need to go over the practical aspects of the inheritance with you. There are papers to sign, accounts to transfer, and legal procedures to follow." Eleanor stood up abruptly. "I need some air," she said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. This is not what I expected." After she left the room, Mr. Morrison turned to me with a gentle smile. "Your father was a good man, Amara. He loved you very much, and he wanted to make sure you were taken care of." "I can't believe this," I said, still holding the envelope. "I never expected. I knew he loved me, but he started planning this about 2 years ago," Mr. Morrison said, "right after his diagnosis. He said he wanted to make sure his real daughter was protected, and that his wealth went to someone who would use it wisely and compassionately." After Mr. Morrison left, I sat alone in the library, holding my father's final letter. The room was quiet, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, and I could smell the familiar scent of old books and leather that had always made this space feel safe and comforting. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope and unfolded the pages inside. My father's handwriting was a little shakier than usual, evidence of the disease that was already taking him away from us, but his words were clear and strong. "My dearest Amara," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then you have just learned that you are now one of the wealthiest young women in the country. I hope that news doesn't scare you too much, because I know you never cared about money or status. But I also hope you understand why I made this choice." I could hear his voice in every word, could picture him sitting at his desk in the study, carefully crafting this final message to me. "I have watched Eleanor struggle with your presence in our family for 20 years, he continued, "and I have tried to be patient with her limitations. I hope that time would help her see you the way I see you. But I have come to understand that some people are simply unable to love beyond their own narrow definitions of family." The words were painful to read, but they were also liberating. Someone had seen the truth, had witnessed the subtle cruelty and conditional love that had shaped so much of my childhood and adolescence. "You are not just my daughter, Amara. You are my legacy. You are everything I hope to pass on to the next generation. Intelligence, compassion, strength, and integrity. You have faced challenges that would have broken lesser people, and you have emerged from each one more beautiful than before." I was crying again, but these were different tears. These were tears of validation, of recognition, of finally understanding that I had been loved completely and unconditionally by the person who mattered most. "I know that inheriting this wealth will bring new challenges," the letter continued, "but I also know that you will use it wisely. You will build something meaningful with it, something that makes the world a little better, and you will do it with grace and humility, because that is who you are." The letter went on for several more pages, filled with memories of our time together, advice for the future, and expressions of love that made my heart ache with loss and gratitude at the same time. But it was the final paragraph that took my breath away. "I want you to know that choosing you was the best decision I ever made. You were not an accident or a charity case or a burden. You were a gift, a miracle, a chance for me to be the father I always wanted to be. You made me better, Amara. You made me whole, and I will love you until the end of time and beyond." I sat in that library for a long time after I finished reading, holding the letter and thinking about everything that had happened. My father's final act of love had been to ensure that I would never again have to question my place in the world, never again have to wonder if I was worthy of love and respect. Eleanor didn't come back downstairs for the rest of the day. I could hear her moving around in her bedroom, probably calling friends or family members, trying to figure out if there was any way to challenge the will. But I knew she would find no comfort there. My father had been thorough, and Mr. Morrison had assured me that the will was uncontestable. That evening, I stood in my father's study, looking at the wall where my childhood report card still hung in its frame. But now I saw it differently. It wasn't just a proud father displaying his daughter's achievement. It was a declaration, a statement to anyone who entered his office that this child, this adopted daughter, was worthy of his pride and his legacy. The next morning, Eleanor finally came downstairs. She looked like she had aged 10 years overnight, her usually perfect appearance disheveled, and her eyes red from crying. She found me in the kitchen, drinking coffee and reading through some of the legal documents Mr. Morrison had left for me to review. "Amara," she said, her voice hoarse and uncertain, "we need to talk." I looked up at her, this woman who had raised me but never truly accepted me, and I felt something I had never felt before, pity. She looked broken, lost, like someone who had just realized that the life she thought she was living had been an illusion. "What would you like to talk about, Eleanor?" I asked, and I noticed that I didn't call her mom. Somehow, after everything that had happened, the pretense felt unnecessary. She sat down across from me, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for a coffee cup. "I don't understand," she said. "How could Richard do this? How could he leave everything to his daughter?" I finished for her, and she flinched at the words. "You know what I mean," she said defensively. "He had obligations. I was his wife for 25 years. I sacrificed my own career, my own interests, to support him and his business. And now I'm supposed to live on $10,000 a month?" I almost laughed at the irony. $10,000 a month was more than most people made in an entire year. But to Eleanor, it represented a dramatic reduction in her lifestyle and status. "Eleanor," I said carefully, "that prenuptial agreement you signed wasn't something Daddy sprung on you. You agreed to it. You knew what you were signing." "I was young and in love," she protested. "I thought it was just a formality. I never imagined he would actually enforce it," but I could see the truth in her eyes. She had known exactly what she was signing, and she had believed that her position as Richard Whitmore's wife would protect her from ever having to live by its terms. She had counted on his love, his loyalty, his sense of obligation to override the legal document. What she hadn't counted on was that his love for me would be stronger than his sense of duty to her. "I think Daddy hoped you would learn to love me," I said quietly. "I think he kept waiting for you to see me as your daughter, not just as his adopted child. But you never did you?" Eleanor's face crumpled, and for a moment I thought she might finally acknowledge the pain she had caused me over the years. But instead, she straightened her shoulders and looked at me with something that might have been resentment. "I tried," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I did try, Amara, but you have to understand. It wasn't easy. You were so different from us. From our world, I never knew how to connect with you." "Different how?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Eleanor looked uncomfortable, as if she was being forced to articulate thoughts she had always kept carefully hidden. "You know what I mean," she said finally. "Your background, your heritage. It was complicated. There it was. The truth that had been lurking beneath the surface of our relationship for 20 years. Eleanor had never been able to see past my race, had never been able to accept that a black child could truly be her daughter. All the polite distance, all the subtle dismissals, all the ways she had made me feel like an outsider in my own home. It all came down to her inability to love a child who didn't look like her. "Complicated," I repeated, and I could hear the ice in my own voice. "Is that what you call it?" Eleanor must have heard the change in my tone, because she quickly tried to backtrack. "That's not what I meant. I mean, I loved you as much as I could. I tried to be a good mother to you." "No," I said, standing up from the table. "You tried to be a good white woman taking care of a black child. You tried to be charitable, generous, kind to the poor little adopted girl, but you never tried to be my mother." The words hung in the air between us. 20 years of unspoken truth finally out in the open. Eleanor opened her mouth to argue, but I wasn't finished. "Do you know what I remember most about my childhood, Eleanor?" I remember feeling grateful. Grateful that you tolerated me. Grateful that you didn't send me back. Grateful that you let me live in your house and eat your food and wear the clothes you bought me. I spent 20 years being grateful for the bare minimum of acceptance from the woman who was supposed to love me unconditionally. Eleanor was crying now, but I found that I didn't care. I had spent too many years absorbing her subtle cruelty, too many years making excuses for her limitations, too many years trying to earn love that should have been freely given. And you know what's funny? I continued. Daddy saw all of it. He saw every time you dismissed me. Every time you made me feel like I didn't belong. Every time you reminded me that I wasn't really your family. And he spent years trying to make up for it, trying to love me enough for both of you. That's not fair, Eleanor protested. I did love you. I loved you differently. You loved the idea of me, I corrected her. You loved being able to tell your friends about your charitable adoption, about how you were helping a disadvantaged child. But you never loved me, Amara. The actual person I am. The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of accumulated hurt and disappointment. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice small and defeated. What happens now? She asked. What happens to me? I looked at this woman who had shaped so much of my childhood, who had given me a home but never made me feel at home in it, and I felt something unexpected. Compassion. You'll be fine, Eleanor, I said gently. You have the house in Martha's Vineyard, your jewelry, and more money than most people see in a lifetime. You can build whatever life you want. But this house, she said, looking around the kitchen where we had shared so many awkward family meals. This has been my home for 25 years. It was Daddy's home, I reminded her, and he wanted it to be my home. But Eleanor, you're welcome to stay until you make other arrangements. I'm not going to throw you out on the street. She looked at me with surprise, as if she hadn't expected such generosity from someone she had treated so poorly. You would do that? After everything I've said? Everything I've done? Daddy taught me that love isn't conditional, I said. He taught me that family takes care of each other, even when it's hard, even when it's not deserved. Just because you never learned that lesson doesn't mean I have to forget it. Over the next few weeks, as Eleanor made arrangements to move to Martha's Vineyard permanently, I began to understand the full scope of what my father had left me. It wasn't just money and property. It was responsibility, opportunity, and the chance to build something meaningful with the resources he had spent a lifetime accumulating. Whitmore Industries was a mid-sized investment firm with clients ranging from wealthy individuals to small corporations. Under my father's leadership, it had grown steadily and maintained a reputation for ethical business practices and solid returns. Now it was mine, along with all the challenges and opportunities that came with running a successful company. But more than the business, more than the money, more than any of the material wealth, what my father had really left me was validation. He had made it clear, in the most public and permanent way possible, that I was his daughter, his heir, and his legacy. No one could ever again question my place in his heart or my right to bear his name. The transformation in how people treated me was immediate and dramatic. Business associates who had always been polite to me now sought my approval and input. Family friends who had smiled at me condescendingly at social events now wanted to have lunch and discuss opportunities for collaboration. Even Eleanor's society friends, who had always treated me like an interesting curiosity, now called to invite me to their charity events and fundraisers. It was educational, watching people recalibrate their relationships with me based on my new financial status. But it was also liberating, because I no longer had to wonder if I belonged in these spaces. I owned many of these spaces now, literally and figuratively, but the most important change was internal. For the first time in my life, I felt truly secure in my identity and my worth. I no longer needed external validation to know that I mattered, that I was loved, that I had a place in the world. My father's final gift to me wasn't just wealth. It was the unshakable knowledge that I was enough, exactly as I was. Eleanor left for Martha's Vineyard on a sunny Thursday morning in June, 3 months after the will reading. I helped her load her car with the last of her personal belongings, and we stood together in the driveway of the house that had been our shared home for so many years. I want you to know, she said, her voice heavy with emotion, that I am proud of you. I may not have shown it the way I should have, but I am proud of the woman you've become." I looked at her. This complicated woman who had given me shelter but not warmth, provisions but not acceptance. And I felt a complex mix of emotions: anger, sadness, pity, and something that might have been forgiveness. "Thank you, Eleanor," I said simply. "I hope you find peace in your new life." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I hope someday you can understand. I hope someday you can forgive me for not being the mother you deserved." "I forgive you," I said, and I meant it. But more importantly, I hope you can forgive yourself. She hugged me then, and for the first time in 20 years, it felt like she was hugging me because she wanted to, not because she thought she should. It wasn't enough to erase the years of pain, but it was something. After she left, I walked through the house that was now truly mine. Each room held memories, some painful, some beautiful, all part of the complex tapestry of my life. In the library where the will had been read, I could still feel the echo of that transformative moment when everything changed. In the kitchen, I remembered countless family dinners where I had tried so hard to fit in, to be worthy of my place at the table. But it was in my father's study that I felt his presence most strongly. I sat in his chair, behind the desk where he had spent so many hours building the business that was now mine, and I opened the drawer where he had kept his most important papers. Inside, I found a folder labeled "For Amara" in his handwriting. It contained copies of all the documents related to my adoption, including a letter he had written to the adoption agency, explaining why he and Eleanor wanted to adopt a child. Reading that letter was like receiving one final gift from beyond the grave. In it, my father had written about their hope to provide a loving home for a child who needs one, and to expand our family through the miracle of adoption. He had written about their excitement at the prospect of becoming parents, about their commitment to loving and supporting whatever child came into their lives. But there was also a note he had written years later, paper-clipped to the original letter. It was dated just 2 years before his death, and it said simply, "Amara exceeded every hope we had when we wrote this letter. She has been the greatest blessing of my life." As I absorbed the weight of his words, I realized that his final act of love hadn't been just about the money, or the business, or the house. It had been about making sure I knew, beyond any doubt, that I had been chosen, cherished, and celebrated every day of my life by the man who mattered most. The months that followed were a whirlwind of activity. I threw myself into learning every aspect of the business, working with the senior partners to understand the complexities of the investment world and the responsibilities that came with leading a firm. It was challenging work, but I had been prepared for it by years of education and by my father's patient mentoring. But I also made changes. I established a scholarship fund for adopted children pursuing higher education. I partnered with organizations that supported families formed through adoption. And I made sure that Whitmore Industries became known not just for solid returns, but for ethical practices and social responsibility. Every decision I made, every policy I implemented, every relationship I built was guided by the lessons my father had taught me and the values he had instilled in me. I was determined to honor his legacy while also making the company and the wealth he had left me into something that reflected my own principles and priorities. 6 months after the will reading, I received an unexpected visitor. Eleanor had driven down from Martha's Vineyard, and she looked different, more relaxed, less rigid, somehow younger despite the passage of time. "I wanted to see how you were doing," she said, accepting my invitation to come in for coffee. "I wanted to see what you've done with the place. I had made some changes to the house, mostly small ones that reflected my own tastes and preferences. I had converted one of the guest rooms into a home office, had rearranged some of the furniture to make the spaces feel more comfortable and livable, and had added artwork and decorations that spoke to my heritage and my interests." Eleanor walked through the rooms with something that looked like wonder, as if she was seeing the house for the first time. "It feels different," she said finally. "Warmer, somehow. More lived in. It feels like home," I agreed. "For the first time, it really feels like home." We sat in the living room, drinking coffee and talking about neutral subjects. The weather, her new life in Martha's Vineyard, my plans for the business. But eventually, The conversation turned to more personal matters. "I've been thinking a lot," Eleanor said, her voice careful and measured. "About everything that happened, about the things I said and did. I've been seeing a therapist, actually." I raised my eyebrows in surprise. Eleanor had always been skeptical of therapy, viewing it as something for people who couldn't handle their own problems. "She's helped me understand some things about myself," Eleanor continued, "about my own childhood, my own insecurities, and how they affected the way I treated you." I waited for her to continue, not sure where this conversation was heading. "I want you to know," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "that my failures as your mother had nothing to do with you and everything to do with me. You were a beautiful, intelligent, loving child who deserved so much better than what I gave you." The words I had waited my entire life to hear, finally spoken with what sounded like genuine remorse and understanding. "I was raised to believe that family was about bloodlines and social status," she continued. "I was taught that love was conditional, that acceptance had to be earned, that some people were simply more worthy than others. It took me 60 years, and losing the man I loved to realize how wrong those beliefs were. I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but they were different from the tears I had shed over the years. These weren't tears of hurt or frustration, but tears of relief and something that might have been healing. "Richard saw what I couldn't see," Eleanor said. "He saw that you were our daughter from the moment you walked into our lives. He saw that family isn't about biology or blood or social standing. It's about love, commitment, and choice. And he chose you, completely and without reservation, every single day." "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for saying that." "I can't undo the past," Eleanor said. "I can't take back the words I said or the love I failed to give. But I want you to know that I see you now, Amara. I see the extraordinary woman you've become, and I am in awe of your strength and grace." We talked for hours that day, perhaps the first real conversation we had ever had. Eleanor told me about her own childhood, about parents who had valued appearance over substance, status over love. She told me about the pressures she had felt as a young woman to marry well and maintain a certain social position. She told me about her own struggles with identity and belonging, struggles that had made it impossible for her to recognize and address my similar struggles. It wasn't an excuse for her behavior, and we both understood that. But it was an explanation, a context that helped me understand the woman who had raised me without ever truly accepting me. When she left that evening, she hugged me again, and this time it felt like a real goodbye, not to our relationship, but to the painful dynamic that had defined it for so many years. "I love you, Amara," she said, and I could hear the truth in her words. I should have said that more often. I should have shown you that more clearly, but I love you, and I am proud to have been part of your life, even if I wasn't the mother you deserved. "I love you too, Eleanor," I replied, and I meant it. "And you're wrong about one thing. You were exactly the mother I needed, because you led me to understand what unconditional love looks like when I found it in Daddy. Everything that happened brought me to this moment, to this understanding of who I am and what I'm worth." Now, as I sit in the library where it all changed, writing this story for all of you who follow Black Revenge Diaries, I want you to understand something important. My father's revenge wasn't cruel or vindictive. It was loving and protective. He saw the pain his wife's limitations caused me, and he used his final act on Earth to make sure I never had to doubt my worth again. But the real revenge, the most satisfying revenge, wasn't the money or the property or the business. It was the knowledge that love wins. It was the understanding that chosen family can be stronger than biological family. It was the recognition that I had been seen, valued, and cherished by the person who mattered most. Some people might say that Eleanor got what she deserved, that my father's will was a fitting punishment for her years of conditional love and subtle cruelty, but I don't see it that way. I think my father's will was an act of love. Love for me, and ultimately, love for Eleanor too. He gave her exactly what she had agreed to when she married him, nothing more and nothing less. And he gave me everything he had to give, which was exactly what a father should do for his daughter. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, if you felt the pain of not belonging and the joy of finally being seen, then I want you to know that you are not alone. Family isn't about who shares your DNA or who gave birth to you. Family is about who shows up for you, who believes in you, who fights for you even when you're not in the room. My father chose me every single day for 20 years. He chose me when I was a scared 3-year-old who didn't understand why I was living with strangers. He chose me when I was a confused child, trying to navigate a world that often made me feel different and out of place. He chose me when I was a teenager struggling with identity and belonging. And he chose me one final time when he wrote his will, making sure the whole world knew that I was his daughter, his heir, and his legacy. That's the kind of love that changes everything. That's the kind of family that makes you whole. And that's the kind of revenge that heals instead of hurts. The revenge of proving that love is stronger than biology, that choice is more powerful than chance, and that worth is determined not by the circumstances of your birth, but by the content of your character and the love you carry in your heart. So, to everyone watching this, everyone who has ever felt like they didn't quite belong, everyone who has ever been told they weren't enough, you are enough. You are worthy of love, of acceptance, of belonging, and if the people who should love you unconditionally can't see your worth, then their failure is not a reflection of your value, but of their limitations. Find your people. Choose your family. Love fiercely and without reservation. And remember that the best revenge is not just living well, but loving well, and being loved in return by people who see you exactly as you are and choose you anyway. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own journey to belonging, then please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Black Revenge Diaries for more stories about how love conquers all, even when it comes from the most unexpected places. My father's final words to me were that choosing me was the best decision he ever made. Today, I can say the same thing about choosing to honor his legacy, to build on the foundation of love he gave me, and to use the gifts he left me to make the world a little bit better, a little bit more loving, and a little bit more accepting of all the different ways that families can be formed and love can be shared. This is my story. This is my father's legacy. And this is proof that blood may be thicker than water, but love is thicker than blood. And in the end, love always wins.